Let's say, okay, so in the last three videos, we took a maximization problem. We've added slack variables to change the constraints to be equations instead of inequalities. And we put that information into the above simplex tableau. And then we decided which column and row we need to use as what's called our pivot column, or pivot column and pivot row, so that we can manipulate this information into a new set of information, which will tell us a more optimal decision than this tableau is telling us. This tableau was our initial one, so it's just telling us we've decided to let x and y be 0, which means zero profit, as the lower right-hand corner in red tells us. And it's telling us that means our slack variables S1, 2, and 3 are equal to the total amount of available resources because we haven't used any resources yet. So what we want to do is manipulate this into a new tableau, which gives us a better decision. So in Excel, this is not too difficult to do, but it's easy to make simple mistakes that just cause you to have to start over. So just follow along, and I'll kind of show you how to do this so those things don't happen. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to copy and highlight our tableau. I'm going to go ahead and keep the column where I've labeled it pivot column. And I'm just going to copy that. And then I'm going to paste, but you have to use paste values and source formatting, because in later steps we're going to use formulas to compute the new numbers. And if you have formulas used to compute numbers and then you copy and paste it causes a kind of formulas that are going through formulas, and it causes problems. So we just want to paste the numbers themselves and the symbols and the formatting. So I've just made a copy. And now we want to manipulate it. So the point is our pivot location is this number 5, because that's the number in the pivot column and pivot row. So our goal is to make the x column have a 1 where this 5 is, and then have zeros everywhere else, because that will make it look like one of these columns over here. In particular, it's going to look like this S3 column does right now, and then all the other columns will kind of change accordingly. Except because of all the zeros in the S1 and S2 columns, they actually won't change, because we will never be actually changing anything, because we'll always be adding 0 of something to something else, and that doesn't change anything. So first thing we need to do, kind of step 1, is let's just get a 1 where this 5 is. Now remember, this is an equation. So in order to do that, I have to divide all of these numbers by 5. And again, an easy way to do this in Excel is, instead of doing that, just click on this cell. We're going to type equals. We're going to go back to the same position in the previous matrix. Click on that cell, and then divide by that 5. That gives us a 1, but we still have to do this to the remaining numbers. So in Excel, we just go back to this new cell that we've created by dividing by 5, and we're going to drag it through the entire row. Now, if you read through these notes before, I said you don't have to use colors, and here's why. You can probably find a way of avoiding this problem if you want to have colors, but just don't have colors. It's a lot easier. Because once I do this, it will now divide all the other numbers by 5, but it's also going to change this green 175 to a yellow cell. So if you have to, you just go back and change that color back, which is what I did just for the purpose of doing this. So at this point, all we've done is manipulated this row. We've divided this equation by 5, so it's really the same equation. But now we want to basically make these numbers 0 and this number negative 10 0. And we're going to do that by adding or subtracting multiples of this 1 to cancel those out. But in order to do that, we have to do it for the entire rows because they are equations. Now the first thing else you want to do, because our pivot column and row is swapping x and s3, go ahead and we're going to change s3 to x because that's going to be our new variable that has a non-zero value. So now what do I want to do? I need to take this number 1, and to make it 0, I'm going to use our pivot position. So 1 minus this 1. So what I'm really going to do is I'm going to say this cell is equal to what it was originally, minus 1, which I don't have to type, times the new pivot row, which is already a 1. So I'm just subtracting 1 minus 1, and that'll give me a 0 where I wanted it. But in order to do that, I have to also, that means I have to take this 2, and I have to subtract 0.2 from it. And I have to take this 1 and subtract 0, and I have to take this 0 and subtract 0, and this 0 minus 0.2, and this 150 minus 35. Because I'm using cells, I just have to drag across, and it'll do them all for me. And again, the color got changed. I'll fix that at the end. Now we just have to change this 3 to 0. Do it the same way. We just type in equals, go up to the same row from the original. And now because it was a 3, I have to subtract 3 times the 1 in our pivot row. And then again, I have to drag across to do the same for all the columns because we're balancing equations. And at this point, I can go back and change these back to green. Now, the last thing we want to do is we need to change the last row because this new decision is basically going to tell us that we're actually constructing some products of x, so we're going to have some profit. So we have to manipulate that in the same manner. In this case, we have a negative 10, so we have to add 10 times the pivot row. So I have to say equals the original objective row value of negative 10 plus 10 times this 1 to get our 0. I didn't get to multiply it. That's an easy mistake you can make. So times that cell gives me the 0. And again, I have to do that for the entire row. So drag across. And again, I lost the red, so I can go back and fix that if necessary. If you just don't use colors, just keep in mind that your pivots are always in this part of the tableau, in the middle part here. That's the only places you can choose your pivot location. And you'll be fine. So what has this done? We've manipulated a system of equations so that it's really the same system of equations. But now what it's telling us is that the x column, the S1 column, and S2 columns are all the pivoted columns. They have a 1 and all zeros. So that's why those appear on the left. Moreover, each of those appears where the 1 is in that column. So the S1 has to appear first because the 1 in the S1 column is the first number. The S2 appears second because the 1 in the S2 column appears second in that column. And x is in the third position because the 1 in the x column is in the third position of that column. So what's the interpretation? Interpretation is our decision is to make 35 units of x and 0 units of y. What that tells us is that S2 is 95, which means by doing that, we have 95 of our original 200 units of resource 2 still available to make more product, if that's possible. And S1 is telling us that we have 115 of the original 150 units of resource 1 available to make more products. And now S1 or S3 is now a non-pivoted column, which is really saying that in this decision, by making all the possible units of X without making any units of Y, we really have utilized all possible values or all possible units of resource 3. Remember, if you go back to the original, if I put 35 in for X, it's 5 times 35. That's the 175. So we've used up all of those resources. But now what this is also telling us is that this decision is giving us a potential profit of 350. And then we repeat this over and over again. We have a new tableau. We've completed the pivot. So now we have to choose our next pivot if necessary. Are there negatives below our variables in the last row? There is. There's only one in this case. So it is the leftmost negative number out of these numbers. So that's our new pivot column. And then we have to decide on a pivot row. So again, we can look at those ratios and compute them by the numbers on the right divided by the number from our pivot column. I drag down for both, and I look at those numbers and which one's the smallest, 27.9. So that's our pivot column now for the next, pivot row I should say, for our next step. And then now what we do is we perform another pivot. All right, and we'll do that next video.